Hello, everyone. My name is Flashfire. I am the author of the Max Speed book series, and this is Suspended Disbelief, my writing and narrative podcast. Episode 1 Genres and Why I Hate Them. Today I have with me a very special guest. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Tempo. I don't know why I'm a very special guest. I'm not anybody special beyond being Flash's friend, but I'm here to bounce. I'm here to bounce questions off with him.
Being my friend makes you special to me. So, are you ready to get into this?
I am very ready to get into this.
In that
Genres
case,
and why you hate them.
yep. So let's start things off simple. What's a genre?
A genre, I suppose, would best be described as like a classification of a book, typically by what it's about, general tropes that are in it.
Right. Like action adventure, sci fi fantasy, horror, thriller.
Romance, mystery, yeah.
Yeah. So I want to get into that because you gave a lot of definitions there. You said what it's about, what tropes it contains.
Hmm.
And that is part of why, to me, genres can be a bit vague and confusing. So I feel like we've pretty solidly defined genres pretty succinctly. They're just ways of classifying a story, typically for the purpose of sorting and organizing them, right? Like you go in a library, you go in a bookstore, you go in an online catalog, you're going to look for things based on their genre.
Yeah.
So, what's my problem? I believe that genres are a poor classification system
Well, obvious question is why do you think that?
because they're confusing. They don't have a clear distinguishing factor in what elements defines them. And I would say that essentially they conflate unrelated elements. There is a poor distinguishing factor between stories and settings when it comes to genres and how they're classified.
So I think I see where you're coming from in that like sci-fi is the the space and high tech versus say mystery where the genre is what it says. A it is a story about finding out the answer to a mystery.
Exactly. Why I think that that's a poor classification system is what if you have a mystery in a sci fi? Which is the predominant genre there? Which is it more so? You are tasked with putting that book on a shelf. All right? You get this cyberpunk story set in the future, but it's following a hard boiled detective. The story, every inch of it, is a classic detective noir story. It's just cyberpunk. Which shelf is it going to go on?
I'm going to be honest with you, probably the science fiction shelf.
Even though the science fiction is the less important element of that story.
Probably. It would probably still end up there.
Yeah, that's my problem. If I go in sci fi, I have no idea what I'm looking at other than that it's probably in space, right? Solid chance it's in space. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's on Earth, just better technology. Most libraries and bookstores are going to lump sci fi and fantasy together. So now you're getting even more conflation because you have possibly the broadest range of stories possible condensed into the same shelf.
No, I get what you're saying. Well, it's like you say. The bookstore in this example is sticking them together because of the aesthetics of the story rather than its actual plot. Other than someone like not wanting to put the book with the spaceship on the cover over by the books with the uh, hard bitten fedora wearing detectives on the cover, I I don't think anyone would ever think to move it to the mystery section.
I don't think anyone would think to either. The tag sci fi is going to be seen before anything else, even if sci fi is not a good representation of what the story is about. The reason for organizing stories in that way is for the purpose of easily finding the kind of story you're looking for, right?
Correct.
If I am looking for a fantastic mystery, right? And I go over to
Right.
the mystery section, I am now missing out on an incredible mystery book that's on the wrong shelf because the detective has a robot arm. So it's sci fi
Mm,
now.
I get you. What's the solution to this, basically?
My solution is honestly just be more specific. I think you need to draw the separation between setting and story. Now, in a physical space, that would mean you have to pick one or the other, right? You have to pick either setting or story to organize things. And in that case, I would say story, not setting. If I'm going in a bookstore, I know what kind of story I want to read. I'm looking for something like that. I go over to the mystery section. That means I'm looking for a mystery, right? That mystery could be in a fantasy world, that mystery could be in a sci fi world, that mystery could be in a historical setting, all of which, under the current system, completely different genres. But I know that the kind of story I want to read is a mystery, so they're all going to be under the mystery shelf. Likewise, and this is a personal complaint I hear a lot, mainly just because of how topical superheroes are currently. Superhero is regarded as a genre, and I fundamentally disagree with that because the entire point of the superhero genre is that you have a very broad array of characters that tackle things from different angles. There's no such thing as a superhero story. Every superhero story is a different type of story with the superhero coat of paint on it. And I would say that for any fantasy story, I would say that for any sci fi story. Settings are a coat of paint that you put over the story that you want to tell. And you pick that coat of paint based on which visual you feels best complements that story. So in a physical space, I would say that you should organize by the type of story rather than the setting. In digital spaces, you can do both. You can separate setting to this side, story type to this side. And that would allow for people to be able to more easily search for the kind of story they're looking for.
I'd say it would help if you're looking for a type of story, but if you are concerned with the aesthetics of the story, you might be bouncing around the bookstore for a while. I know that there's a delineation that happens pretty often. Some genre subsection will get a big jump, and you end up with an additional section of, for example, supernatural romance was very big. I think it's still pretty big. Delineation inside of genre would probably help people who are not trying to run all across the bookstore because they want space books. Let's say there's a particularly prolific author in the fantasy space, and he's done a bunch of different genres within a fantasy setting. Would he be spread out across the bookstore?
In that case, that is what promotional shelves are for, to market just the thing that's big right now. But if someone is just looking for books that take place in space, there's two solutions to that. Solution A, you can divide up sections of the building by setting and still organize by story type within those sections. That is my less preferred solution, but that's just down to my personal tastes and opinions. Or solution B, the inverse. You divide section ups by story type, and then on the shelves you organize by setting. Because then, if you want books that take place in space, go to any section and just look for the space shelf.
What, in your opinion, would be the genres that things would be divided into?
I would define it by if the story recognizably has a structure to it. An adventure story has a recognizable structure to it. An action story has a recognizable structure to it. A spy thriller has a recognizably separate structure to it from a supernatural thriller. And you can have a paranoia thriller with supernatural elements in it, because that is where I would classify a paranoia thriller falling within a fantasy setting. That could be a modern fantasy setting, that could be a high fantasy setting, or that could be some other variation of a fantasy setting. A good example of a paranoia thriller falling under a less traditional setting would be Captain America the Winter Soldier. That story is still very much a story about secrets, betrayal, deception, conspiracies. It is a paranoia thriller within a superhero setting.
Since we've brought in films to it, uh, what about a series that hops genres? Uh, Captain America currently has three coming up on four movies and a TV series. One is a war story, two is a paranoia thriller, a spy story, and three is a three is an action movie through and through about probably the most superheroes smashing your action figures together kind of story you can get. Where does that go?
So that's an excellent point. That is the most solid argument against how I would classify stories, but I would say that even holds up under the current genre classification system.
I'm from the era of blockbuster. All three of those movies would probably be generically shoved under action.
Or superhero, because that's the characters that are in them.
Mm.
But yeah, action would probably be the through line. You're right, that's a difficult point because you would either have to stretch yourself to find a through line through a series, and as the series continues, that through line could change. So you might have to stretch yourself to find a through line for the series. You might just have to classify series by themselves. And I understand that that would be a very difficult thing to do because, first off, that's a break from the pattern. If we're separating by story structure and then series is over here by itself, well, it being a series doesn't tell me what the structure of each book in the series is. I would say for the most part, series of movies, series of books do tend to have a consistent storyline to them. As you said, all of the Captain America films are action films. All of the Percy Jackson books, even though they have different themes to them, are all very easily classified as adventure books. Where you would run into weird edge cases are where it would break even the current genre classification that we have. For instance, how would you classify the Twilight Zone?
Probably under just as a general guideline, probably under horror.
Really?
I know there are edge cases and uh, more wackier episodes, but I think horror or thriller would probably be the best through line for all of the Twilight Zone.
I would lean more towards psychological thriller, because that is the through line. Is it's less about scaring you and more about playing with your perception.
Mm.
It certainly couldn't be unified under a setting because every episode of The Twilight Zone was based on a completely different premise.
Hmm.
You had settings about aliens, settings about eldritch entities, settings about gods, settings about demons, settings about magic, settings that were relatively normal and realistic, but had Truman Show esque paranoia, realistic settings, realistic technology, but still unrealistic scenario that toys with the mind of the prospective character. What I would say for that is that psychological thriller would be a stronger classification than anything else because it does acknowledge a recurring theme throughout the story. And that is why I feel the story classification is more important than the setting classification, because typically, even if a story jumps around a bit, typically if it is considered part of the same series, and I wanna draw the clarification between same series as opposed to same franchise. If it's part of the same series, that means it's multiple installments in the same story. It is going to have a through line in the themes. It is going to be playing along the same general ideas that were introduced in the first one. Whether it is expanding upon those ideas, challenging those ideas, most series are going to have a through line in the theming, which lends itself to the type of story that is being told.
What do you say to, let's take Star Wars. Star Wars has more books than there are days in the year. Um, so are we talking about breaking up every like individual Star Wars series that's come out? Say the X-wing, the X-wing books, the Thrawn trilogy, Dawn of the Jedi, that sort of thing. Putting them in where they would most reasonably belong in the story-based paradigm, and breaking up Star Wars into that sort of way, or would you want to keep all of Star Wars as sort of a this big section of its own?
I would say either option is viable. For the same reasoning behind promotional shelves and trends, Star Wars is a big enough thing on its own that is entirely reasonable to want to just have a big Star Wars section. Pretty much every time anything comes out for Star Wars, it renews an interest in the franchise twice as big as the previous one. Even if it's bad, even if something bad happens in the Star Wars franchise, there is still a massive wave of interest in Star Wars. So it is entirely reasonable to put Star Wars in its own section and then subdivide by story structure within that Star Wars section. However, I would say that if you're not going to do that, if you're not going to have a big promotional Star Wars section, there is nothing wrong with separating Star Wars across all these different story types because Star Wars is that big. Star Wars is such a huge and vast universe that it caters to having different story types. If I go into a mystery section, I'm looking for a good mystery, and I find a Star Wars book in the mystery section, that is naturally going to interest me because, yeah, I'm a fan of Star Wars, and I'm looking for a mystery book, and now I have a mystery in the Star Wars universe? That's perfect. Like, that's fantastic. If I am someone that has a vague interest in Star Wars but doesn't engage with a lot of it because it doesn't suit my particular interests, but I'm going through the political thriller section. I want Tom Clancy style books that follow vast political machinations, that follow the intricacies of navigating layers of bureaucracy and war and military strategy and balancing all these high level factors, and I run into the newer Thrawn trilogy, not the Heir to the Empire trilogy. If I am into more that sort of story, and so I go to a section for political thriller, and I find those Thrawn books there, that is now something within this setting that I enjoy that caters specifically to the type of story that I'm looking for.
Yeah, no, I understand perfectly. So I got one more thing, and that's the real roadblock to what you want, I think, is that there's something of a stigma against sci-fi and fantasy being outside of their designated zone. Is this something that a new system would have to fight against, or is it something that would need to be broken down first?
Anytime you change things, there's always going to be people who wish for the way it was before. Not saying those people are right, not saying those people are wrong. Sometimes there are valid benefits to the previous way things were handled. I believe that over time, genre stigma would be broken down by the existence of a system like this. I think there would certainly be backlash if things were changed to a system like this, but I think there would be a backlash for any type of change. That's just the nature of change. People are stubborn. People get used to the way things are and sometimes lose sight of the way things can be.
Well, that's all my questions for right now.
All right then. Thank you for joining me, Tempo. Once again, I am Flashfire, author of the Max Speed book series. Max Speed is a superhero action adventure series about a young teenage boy going through high school when it is suddenly exposed to everyone around him that he has superpowers. And he has to manage the changes in his life with fighting against all of these disasters and these villains coming after him. He's forced into a lot of early growth, into a lot of conflict that requires him to change and to learn things that a lot of the people around him haven't had to deal with. If you are interested in checking out the Max Speed book series, you can find them on Amazon. If you are interested in more of my work or the work of my other coworkers, you can check us out at bookworm.com. That is BUCHWYRM.com. Thank you very much and have a wonderful rest of your days.